In 1861, on the island of Herta, 40 miles out into the Atlantic, beyond the last of the Hebrides, a boy of 10 could walk backwards off the edge of one of the highest sea cliffs in Britain, barefoot, on wet rock. On a rope he had helped to plait himself, and an hour later he would come back over the top with the evening's food knotted to his belt. Today, most of us will not stand near a guardrail without our stomach turning, but here is what I want you to hold on to. Number 14 on this list left a handful of people stranded on a bare rock in the open ocean, and while they waited, everyone on the island behind them began to die. And number 3? Visitors who watched these men on the cliffs wrote home that it did not look human, and no climber alive has quite matched it since. These were not stunts. They were skills learned in childhood on a rock where nobody was coming to help. If a world this extraordinary deserves to be remembered, subscribe. Now let's count down the 25 lost skills that kept St Kilda alive for 2,000 years, until everyone left overnight. Number 25. The Parliament. Every morning, after prayers, the men of St Kilda walked out into the single street of the village and stopped and stood and talked. They called it the Parliament, and they meant it. There was no chief, no chairman, no vote, and no one whose word counted for more than another's. Any man could speak, and every man did, until the island had decided together what the day required, which cliffs to work, which boats to launch, whose roof to mend, how to divide the ropes. Then they went and did it. No police ever set foot on the island, because none was ever needed. Whole nations, with libraries of law, cannot manage what a few dozen people did in a street every morning, on nothing but the assumption that everyone would carry their share. Number 24. Share and share alike. St Kilda ran on one rule so complete it barely needed saying, what the island took, the island split. The cliffs were divided fairly between the families, and so was the catch. When the fowling boats came back low in the water, the whole take was counted out and shared, household by household, so that a family with strong young sons and a family with none both ate. There was no money on the island, and for most of its history, no locks on the doors, because there was almost nothing a man could own that his neighbor did not have too. They dissolved scarcity and suspicion with a single habit, and it held longer than any bank has been open. Number 23. The mailboat. When the islanders needed to reach the outside world and no boat could cross the winter sea, they built one the size of a shoe. A block of wood, hollowed out, with a little hatch on top, burned with the words St Kilda Mailboat. Inside went a letter and a penny for whoever found it to buy the stamp. They lashed it to a float, an inflated sheep's bladder, or later a sealed tin, waited for a hard westerly wind and threw it into the Atlantic. And it worked. St Kilda mailboats washed up on the beaches of Lewis, on Orkney, and some crossed all the way to the coast of Norway, and kind strangers posted the letters on. It was the slowest, strangest postal service on earth, dependent entirely on the wind and the decency of whoever picked it up. Today, one sits behind glass in a museum, and we complain when a parcel is a day late. Number 22. Drying food in the wind. On St Kilda there were no trees, so there was almost no wood for smoke, and salt had to be bought from a world they could barely reach. So they preserved the winter's food a third way, with the wind itself. All across the slopes of Herta they built small huts of dry stone, roofed with turf, mortar-free, with gaps left in the walls on purpose. They are called cleitean, and there are more than 1,000 of them. Over 1,200 on the main island alone, and more on every stack and outlying isle. Inside, out of the rain but open to the endless Atlantic wind, they hung their birds, their eggs, their turf and their fish, and let the moving air draw the moisture out until the meat kept for months. No salt, no smoke, just architecture and weather. The cleiteans still stand across the island in their thousands. The knowledge that filled them does not. Number 21. The rope. On St Kilda, a man's most precious possession was not his house or his boat. It was his rope. Plaited by hand, often bound in a sheath of cowhide so the rock could not saw through it. A good rope took real skill to make and was guarded like an heirloom, handed down father to son and named in a man's will, because it was the thing his family's life hung from. In keeping with the island's character, the longest and best ropes were shared. Island property brought out for the big cliffs and far stacks. Everything you are about to hear depended on this one braided cord. Today we sell rope by the metre and think nothing of it. There, it was the single thinnest line between a wedding and a funeral. Everything they owned, they paid for on the cliffs. And the cliffs are where this list turns dangerous. Number 20. Going over the edge. This was the skill at the center of everything, and it began with an act of pure trust. One man tied on and backed toward the drop. A second man, his partner, sometimes his brother, set his heels, took the rope over his shoulder, and became the only thing between his friend and the sea hundreds of feet below. Then the first man leaned back into nothing and walked down the cliff face, barefoot for grip, into the updraught and the deafening noise of 100,000 nesting birds. He worked with both hands while his whole weight hung on a rope held by another human being's back. Modern climbers do this with steel bolts, harnesses and helmets, and they call it extreme. A St Kildan did it with a friend and a length of plaited hair, and he called it Tuesday. Number 19. The fulmar. If one bird was the heart of St Kilda, it was this one, a grey and white seabird that most of us would walk past without a glance. To the islanders, it was almost everything. They ate its flesh fresh in summer and preserved for winter. They saved its feathers for the rent. They rendered its oil for their lamps and their medicine. By some accounts, each person on the island got through more than 100 fulmars in a year. The birds were taken from the ledges in their tens of thousands each season at exactly the right week, before the young could fly. To us, the word seabird means a shape on the horizon. To them, it meant light, warmth, food, income and survival, all in a single creature they took off a cliff with a rope and a rod. Number 18. The puffin and the fowling rod. The fulmar and gannet were taken by hand and rope, but the puffin, small, quick, present in enormous numbers, needed a tool, so they made one, a long, light rod with a running noose of stiff horsehair at the tip. A fowler lay still among the burrows on the grassy slopes, reached out with the rod, and slipped the noose over a bird before it knew he was there. Others set gins and snares among the burrows and worked them all day. In a good season, the take ran to many thousands. The puffins fed the island and baited the fishing lines. Their skins and feathers went into the pile that paid the landlord. The slopes are thick with puffins again today, wheeling in their thousands over empty ground. Nobody has worked them in living memory. Number 17. The eggs on the ledges. The birds were only half the harvest. The other half was eggs, taken by the thousand from ledges most people could not look at without flinching. This was not smash and grab. It was knowledge. A fowler had to know which ledge held which bird, which week each species laid, and how to carry a soft cargo of eggs back up a vertical cliff without crushing a single one. Into the early 20th century, the islanders were still taking something like 5,000 guillemot eggs in a single year, stored away in the cleitean against the hungry months. Today, it is a criminal offence to lift one wild egg off that cliff. Then, it was a childhood chore. Number 16. The Mistress Stone. On St Kilda, a young man could not simply decide he was ready to marry. He had to prove it on the rock. There was a stone that jutted out over a terrible drop, and the test was to go out onto it and balance there, over the open air, showing the nerve and control the cliffs would demand of a provider. The logic was brutal and simple. A man who could not work the cliffs could not feed a wife and children, so mastery of the rock decided whether he was ready for a family at all. A rite of passage that was also a job interview held above a 500-foot fall. We hand out adulthood with a driving license. They earned it on the edge of a cliff. The birds fed them, clothed them, and paid their rent. And number 14 is where this list stops being about skill and starts being about survival. We're saving Britain's vanishing skills one video at a time. Subscribe and stay for number 3. Number 15. Landing on the stacks. Out beyond Herta stand two great fangs of black rock rising sheer from the sea. Stack Lee and Stack and Armin, the tallest sea stacks in Britain. They were covered in birds, so the men went to them, and simply getting onto them was a skill that could kill you. There is no beach, no jetty, nothing. Only a heaving open boat below and a wall of wet rock streaming with spray. A man had to judge the swell, wait for the lift of the right wave, and leap from the pitching boat onto the streaming stone and catch a hold and hang on, with the Atlantic dropping away beneath his feet. Then he did it again with the next man and the next. Every island remembered the ones who mistimed the jump. That memory was the safety briefing, the only one they got. Number 14. And this is the one I promised you, stranded on the stack. In 1727, a small fowling party, a few men and boys, was put ashore on Stack and Armin to work the birds, as they had 100 times, and the boat rowed back to Herta, meaning to return in a few days. It never came. Behind them, smallpox had broken out on the main island and swept through the tiny population so savagely that not enough fit adults were left to launch a boat and cross to the stack. So the fowling party waited. Through the autumn and into the winter, on a bare rock in the open Atlantic, kept alive on birds, on rainwater, and on the shelter of the stone huts their own people had built there, not knowing whether anyone was still alive at home at all. They were finally taken off the following spring, 9 months later. They had survived. Many of the people they came home to had not. Number 13. The gannet harvest. The largest of the seabirds was the gannet, the solan goose, the islanders called it, and it was hunted on the great stacks in numbers that are hard to believe. A visitor in the late 1600s reckoned the island took something like 20,000 of them in a year. The men climbed to the colonies, often at night or in the grey before dawn when the birds were slow, took the plump young, the guga, and lowered them to the boats by the ropeful, then wine-dried them in the cleitean for the winter ahead. It was an entire meat industry run off a vertical rock with no machinery of any kind, and it has not quite died. To this day, by special license, the men of one village on Lewis still sail out each year to take a fixed number of young gannets, the last thread of a craft that once fed a nation of bird-eaters. Number 12. Rowing to the far islands. The birds were not only on Herta. Some of the richest fowling was on Borare and its stacks, miles across open water, and to reach them the men rowed. No engine, no shelter, just oars and backs and a reading of the sea. They would land, climb, and often stay for days, sleeping in cleitean out on the far rock, working the colonies from dawn until the boat came back for them and their catch. It meant committing yourself and a few others to an uninhabited rock in one of the roughest seas in Europe, trusting the weather to let you home. People pay now to visit those stacks for an afternoon, cameras ready when the sea allows. The St Kildans went to work there, and the sea did not always allow. Number 11. Rendering the oil. Every fulmar carried, in its stomach, a store of rich oil, and the islanders learned to draw it off and keep it. That oil was one of the most valuable things on St Kilda. It burned in their lamps through the long dark, was rubbed on aches and wounds as medicine, and went into the barrels shipped out to pay the rent. A bird that gave you food, feathers and light in one body was not a nuisance on a cliff. It was a harvest. The knowledge of how to take that oil cleanly, store it, and use it ran through every household. And there is a shadow to it, which we will come back to at the very end, because the same oil that lit their winters may have carried a grief into their cradles that they never understood. The birds did more than feed them. The birds paid the rent, and number 3 is coming. Number 10. Feathers as money. Once a year, the landlord's steward sailed out to collect what St Kilda owed, and much of it was paid in feathers. So the plucking, cleaning and sacking of down was not a chore on the edge of life. It was the island's cash crop. Whole households worked at it, filling sack after sack of feathers stripped from the season's birds to be weighed and taken away against the rent. An economy that most places ran on coins and cattle, St Kilda ran largely on the soft grey down of a seabird. Their rent was measured in feathers. Ours leaves the account by direct debit before we ever see it. Number 9. Everything from a bird. The islanders wasted almost nothing that a bird could give. The tough skin of a gannet's neck was worked into shoes. Feather quills became thread and rough needles. Down filled the beds that kept children warm through Atlantic gales, and bone was worked into small tools and pegs. When your entire supply chain is a cliff full of seabirds and there is no shop within 40 miles of stormwater, you learn to see a single creature as a whole warehouse, and to let none of it go to waste. We buy a dozen single-use things before breakfast. They built a life where the idea of throwing something useful away would not have made sense. Number 8. Plucking the sheep. St Kilda kept sheep, but not the sheep you are picturing, and they did not shear them. The island's ancient breeds, the soe and the borere, are primitive animals that shed their own wool naturally each year, the way a wild animal molts. So instead of shearing, the islanders practiced ruing, catching each sheep at the right moment in early summer and plucking the loosening fleece off by hand in handfuls without a blade. It sounds gentler than the shears you saw in the last video, and in a way it was. But it was slower, and it demanded you know each animal and read exactly when its coat was ready to let go. The wool went to make the cloth that, like the feathers and the oil, helped close the account with the landlord. Number 7. Weaving the rent. The plucked wool did not stay wool. The islanders spun and wove it into tweed, hard-wearing cloth made by hand, the third pillar of the rent, alongside the feathers and the oil. Making it was a whole winter's work, carding, spinning and weaving in the smoky light of the houses through the months when the cliffs were too wild to work. The finished bolts were folded away for the steward's visit. Their taxes were not paid in money, but in cloth they had grown on the backs of their own sheep and made with their own hands. A heritage label today. A tax bill then. Number 6. The reckoning. Once a year, the whole system came to a head when the steward arrived and the island settled its account, entirely without cash. So many barrels of oil, so many stones of feathers, so many bolts of tweed, so many fleeces, so many birds. It was an economy of real complexity balanced in kind. What was owed, what was set aside for winter, what could be spared. And they had to hold their own bargaining with a man from the world of money who knew its tricks. A moneyless economy is not the absence of economics. It is economics done in the head, in birds and oil and cloth, with winter survival riding on the sums. And now the 5 that the whole 2,000 years stood on. Number 5. The One Gate. For all its cliffs and stacks, St Kilda had exactly one place a boat could reasonably come and go: Village Bay. A single curve of shore open to the whole force of the Atlantic. And so a craft grew up around that one gate, knowing the bay's moods, reading when it would let a boat in and when it would smash one on the rocks, and hauling the island's precious boats up above the storm surge each time they landed. The whole island's contact with the outside world. The steward, the mail, the rare visitor, the way out in an emergency, funneled through that one strip of water. They lived behind a door that opened only when the sea was in the mood, and built their whole lives around reading its temper. Number 4. The birds that vanished. Here is a detail that tells you just how cut off this world was. In the summer of 1840, on Stacken Armin, some of the islanders caught a large, strange, flightless bird they did not recognize. A great auk. They kept it alive a few days and then, unnerved, believing it a witch that had brought a storm, killed it. That bird was the last great auk ever recorded in Britain. A whole species was ending in their hands, and they had no way to know it. No newspaper, no naturalist, no word from a world already mourning the bird elsewhere. The sea around St Kilda had always seemed infinite, an endless larder. It was not. And the islanders, 40 miles from anywhere, were the last to find out. Number 3, the one I promised you, what the cliffs did to the men. A lifetime spent barefoot on vertical rock did not just teach these men to climb. By every account of the visitors who watched them, it remade them. Observers wrote home, half disbelieving, at the way St Kildans moved on a cliff face. The grip of their hands, the way their bare feet seemed to read the rock, the calm of a man working over a lethal drop as though standing in a field. It looked, they said, like something not quite human. And yet it was entirely human, simply built by starting at the age of 3 and never stopping. The whole survival of the island was carried in those trained bodies and handed down, father to son, on the cliff itself. No modern climber, with all our gear and science, has quite matched what those men did with a rope of hair and their bare feet. And when the last of them stepped onto a boat, that knowledge, which had no book, only bodies, left with them for good. Number 2. Knowing the birds better than the scientists. The men of St Kilda held, in trained memory, a knowledge of seabirds so complete that when naturalists finally reached the island, they found the islanders already knew more than the science of the day. Every ledge and its owner. Every species' habits, arrivals, departures, temperaments. Where each kind nested, when it laid, when it fledged, how it behaved in fog and gale. None of it was written down. It lived in the heads of men who had learned it the only way possible, by working those cliffs from childhood, every season, for a lifetime. The visiting experts came to record the birds. They ended up interviewing the men. Number 1. The skill that carried all the others, the community itself. Because in the end, the greatest thing St Kilda knew how to do was not fowling, or roping, or drying, or weaving. It was being St Kilda. A few dozen people, on a rock beyond the edge of the map, governed themselves without a ruler, shared everything without a ledger, needed no money and no outside world, and passed the entire operating system of their survival to their children simply by living it in front of them every single day for 2,000 years. That was the masterpiece. A whole self-sufficient civilization small enough to fit in one street. And it is also why it ended so completely and so fast. A way of life that lives only in shared habit and trained memory has no backup. Once the young began to leave, for the mainland, for the ships, for a wider world that finally came calling, the chain of hands that carried everything began, quietly, to break. Stand back and see it whole. For roughly 2,000 years, a community fed, clothed, warmed, housed and paid for itself off seabirds and a rope, and answered to no one but each other. And then, in the space of a lifetime, it was gone. Steamships brought tourists, and with them new illnesses to a people with no resistance. The First World War pulled the island into the wider world. The young left for lives that did not hang from a cliff. And the same isolation that had preserved this world for 2 millennia had always had a darker face. For generations, roughly half to 2/3 of the island's newborns died in their first weeks of a sickness they could not defeat until the outside world reached them, too late, with clean hands. On the 29th of August, 1930, the last 36 St Kildans asked to leave. They put out their fires, left their doors open, laid a Bible in each house, and stepped onto a ship. 2,000 years closed in a single morning, and no one has lived there since. So here is my challenge to you. Find one thing, just one, that you depend entirely on strangers for, that your own great-grandparents could do with their own hands. Your food, your warmth, your water, your neighbors. Then tell me in the comments which one it was and whether you think we gained more than we lost. Because these were never just chores. They were the operating system of a whole civilization that could feed, clothe, warm and govern itself from one rock in the open Atlantic. And it disappeared in a single lifetime. Subscribe. Next, we leave the cliffs for the glens and the gamekeepers and poachers who spent 100 years using their skills against each other in the dark. That story is coming.